A quick heads up, I'm going to spoil some of the early game stuff in Barbuta and some of the late game stuff in Mooncat. These games are best played blind, and like the whole thesis of this essay is that you should play them, so... Actually, this whole thing is kind of counterproductive, isn't it? Huh. Oh well. Anyway, proceed at your own risk. When you start up Barbuta, you are treated to this screen. There's no music, the game doesn't have music, and there's no options or anything. But then you hesitantly hit a button and realize this isn't the title screen. There is no title screen. You're just in there, you're in the game. Okay, well, looks like a side-scroller, you usually go right in side-scrollers. So you start moving right. This little knight dude's kinda slow. Okay. Oh. This is most people's introduction to the game, this beginner's trap, and it leads a lot of people to write Barbuta off, I think. And that's a shame because the game is amazing. At the time of writing this, I have put 8 hours into it. I have completed it multiple times, I have gotten both endings, I can beat the game with all items in 15 minutes. I still have not done everything. But let's back up a bit. Barbuta is an adventure game released in 1982 by UFOsoft, then LX Systems, for their 8-bit LX machine in August of 1982. Its developer, Thorsten Petter, made it in secret on company time, almost getting fired for it. This is the first game UFOsoft ever released. Except none of that is true, because actually Barbuta is the first game in UFO 50, an indie game released in September 2024 by Mossmouth LLC. You know, the company that made Spelunky? It's a collection of 50 games, which within the world of UFO 50 are the first 50 games released by a made-up company called UFOsoft between 1982 and 1989. The games feature a retro aesthetic, with limited color palettes and small sprites, and all just use the D-pad and 2 face buttons. And of those 50 games, Barbuta is the first one on the list. It's not the first one Mossmouth developed, but it is the one they chose to put first in the fictional chronology. And a lot of people seem to think you should skip it. Seriously, this is a sentiment I've seen a ton when people are discussing the collection. At the very least, people would say not to start with Barbuta, and I think that's mostly fair. It's a very obtuse game, it's got a little jank to it, and it'll demand a good bit of patience and time. But it seems to have garnered a bit of a reputation for being one of the worst games of the 50, which is, frankly, a load of bull, because this game is amazing. Wikipedia credits Barbuta to Eirik Suhrke, who previously did the audio for Spelunky and Downwell. Wikipedia, frustratingly, does not provide a source for this, and I could not find one, so take this with a grain of salt. Eirik was the third member to join the development of UFO 50, which was the brainchild of legends Derek Yu and John Perry. I find it kind of funny that Barbuta, a game with no music, was apparently the brainchild of a musician. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. Barbuta is a side-scrolling adventure game. You have 2 buttons, jump and stab. It's a Castlevania-style jump. Once you're in the air, you're locked into that jump arc, even if it's taking you directly into a pool of acid. You also move kinda slowly. What's interesting about its take on this formula is actually those eggs over there on the right-hand side. Those are your lives. When you die in one hit by the way, you respawn as an egg. You are invulnerable while in the egg, and a couple button taps will break you out. Don't break out at the wrong time though. You have no invincibility frame, so if there's an enemy on top of you, well, that's a second egg gone. If you run out of eggs, and remember you only get 6, it's game over. You start back from square one on that first screen. No progress is retained, it's like you've started a new save file. Although the game doesn't actually have save files, presumably the in-universe cartridge didn't come with a battery to keep the RAM going. Which is why that beginner's trap from earlier is such a dick move, right? Because now you have one less egg. What the hell? But actually that trap's got some game design in it. It's there to teach you a few things. One is the egg system. You now know your life is fragile and precious, like an egg. But it also teaches you that you have to pay attention. See, if you look closely, that tile the trap's trigger is on is slightly different from the tiles around it. And this is important because spotting things like that is critical to being able to beat the game. So by falling into this trap now, we're setting ourselves up for success later. The third thing it teaches you is that you're gonna have to restart Barbuta a lot. But you're sure as hell not gonna fall into that trap again. See, here's the thing about Barbuta. It's cryptic as all hell. The game is packed with secrets. You'll get an item and you'll wonder, what the heck does this do? But the game won't tell you. You have to figure it out on your own. It's like a knot puzzle. You have to pick at it, slowly pull it apart until it finally unravels. The closest thing I can compare it to is playing a game like the original Legend of Zelda or Metroid, except you don't keep anything when you die, and the copy you rented didn't have the manual. You don't know what you're doing there, you don't know where to go, you don't know what anything does, you just kinda have to figure it out as you go. And it's amazing. I find it very nostalgic. And it's weird that it's nostalgic for me because I was born in the late 90s and didn't really gain sentience until the early 2000s, well after this era of games had mostly passed us by. My first console was the Game Boy Advance SP, for crying out loud. I remember looking up guides on GameFAQs for almost every game I owned, so it's this weird nostalgia for an era I never really got to experience. And I'm so glad that I decided to try and beat it without a guide, because when I got to this room I spotted this wall that looked a little weird, and when I went inside I found this treasure chest, and inside that chest was an item whose sprite I could not even make a guess at, and it was only later that I noticed, wait, these acid drops aren't hurting me anymore? And realized it was an umbrella, and that was the best feeling in the world. We live in a time where modern AAA game design largely means sanding off all the edges, and I can't help but feel that kinda leaves us with not a lot left. Like sure, it's great that games are such seamless, unfrustrating experiences now, but some of my favorite games are full of edges, and I remember them a lot more fondly than I do most of what's being put out by the big studios these days. Aside from Nintendo. Love you, Nintendo. Please don't ever copyright strike any of my videos, thanks! In accordance with the game having edges, Barbuta also has this one enemy. It's a big spooky skull. He roams the map, moving one square in a random direction every time you change screens. You can see his position in the bottom left hand corner at all times, but the bastard's good at sneaking up on you. There's a unique terror to walking into a room and starting to go down a ladder, only to see him phase in and realize you're not gonna make it out in time. Doubly so because if he touches you, you lose all your eggs instantly and game over. He's not hard to avoid, but when he gets you, he gets you. And sometimes it's bullshit, but it adds some random spice to your adventure, and I just think he's neat. Did I mention the game is also kind of a Metroidvania? Yeah, it's kind of a Metroidvania. As you go along, you'll find items which enable you to progress further into other zones. That umbrella I mentioned earlier lets you get up this ladder, which gives you a way to get from the bottom middle of the map to the bottom left instead of having to go in from the top, which requires you to get through what I have not so affectionately dubbed Mushroom Hell. It's also conveniently on the way from getting the necklace, which can be a required item to beat the game, and this is where a big part of the Barbuta experience rears its head: the routing. See, since you only have 6 lives, you'll be starting over from the top a lot. This gives you a lot of freedom to explore early on. Die in one place, try going the other way. But slowly you'll start to develop a route. Mine was to get the umbrella, then the necklace, then climb up that ladder I mentioned earlier, make my way up to the surface, go through Mushroom Hell, get the key, etc. But the cool thing is that there are a lot of routes you can take through the game. There's actually 3 separate ways you can get to the final boss. I never even found the third. And that's really cool because it means each player will have their own unique path through the game. Beating Barbuta on your own without a guide is a unique experience, one I think you owe it to yourself to try. Because you can beat it in less than 15 minutes, but gaining all the knowledge to do that? That takes hours. Pretty good for a game you basically paid 50 cents for. And sure, the game's a little janky. I had a lot of trouble with the ladders in particular. I'm not sure if this was a bug or intended or my controller, but sometimes my character would start climbing a ladder when I tried to walk past it, and other times he refused to get on the bloody thing at all. I've also mentioned that the game has no music. In fact, besides sound effects, the only thing you'll hear is a little hum when you load a new screen, which is I think a bit unfortunate, but it's done with intention. See, as I mentioned earlier, in the fictional world of UFO 50, Barbuta was the first game UFOsoft ever developed, and it wasn't even an official product. It was made by one guy, in 1982, so it actually makes in-universe sense for it to be a little undercooked. But I don't think it even needs this excuse, because it's an amazing game. I had a blast playing it. Put a weekend into it. You won't be disappointed. But if I can't convince you to do that, can I at least convince you to play Mooncat? Mooncat, in the fictional world of UFO 50, was released in 1985. It's a side-scrolling platformer, and the description of the game states that it was conceived as a spiritual successor to Barbuta. Thorsten Petter spent 2 whole years perfecting it. And it shows. The most notable thing about Mooncat from a gameplay perspective is its control scheme. It is hard to convey how strange it feels to play this game. Basically, the D-pad, any direction, moves you left. The face buttons, either one, moves you right. You can jump by holding the direction you want to go and then hitting the other button. You can slam down and bounce off enemies by pressing the other button again. The button you are holding after slamming will determine the direction you bounce. You can also dash and run and air spin, and it's a lot to ask of you when the controls are this weird. But they're not weird in a Bennett Foddy way. It's not like QWOP. This isn't a control scheme you have to constantly fight with. It's actually remarkably easy to get good at Mooncat's controls. They actually feel really good. You just have to rewire your brain first. This is what playing a video game with a controller for the first time must feel like. Beyond its controls, though, Mooncat is just overall a very surreal experience. There's no real story. You are this weird walking fetus thing, and your goal is to find an egg. And you do this by walking and running and sliding and bouncing your way through each level. There are forests, mountains, caves, temples. There are even a few underwater sections where you have to swim. That's right, Mooncat has swimming. But you do it. You rewire your brain, you learn the controls, you get to the end, you fight the boss, difficult but you have infinite retries unlike Barbuta, you find the egg and there's nothing in it. Just goo. Slime and miasma. And then you look at the condition for the cherry for Mooncat, the optional 100% challenge included with every game in the collection, and you find that there are 2 more eggs, and you go, how? And this is where the spirit of Barbuta is invoked, because like Barbuta, Mooncat is also packed with secrets. Because as it turns out, anytime you see a flower in the background in Mooncat, that means there's a warp hidden nearby. Warps can take you further along on your path, but certain warps will take you to completely new areas. And so it becomes a hunt for the other 2 eggs, searching every screen for clues. Did you know that if you jump over a skull from the right, it spawns a platform? Did you know you can bounce above the top of the screen? Did you know? This is the part where I admit I did use a guide for Mooncat. See, with Barbuta, all the secrets you need to find to beat the game are telegraphed. This wall looks a little different, that acid pool isn't moving. There's more obscure stuff, sure, but it's not required. Mooncat feels a little too obscure sometimes. Its saving grace is that the rules are consistent. If there's a flower, there's a warp. If there's a skull, you can make a platform appear. But you have to work these out for yourself. There are skulls in Barbuta too, they give you money if you beat all the enemies on the screen, but there's also an NPC who gives you a hint about that. Mooncat has no hints. In my first playthrough I found 1 warp, completely by accident. It was this one up here. It wasn't one of the required ones, the actual optimal path you want to take skips that screen entirely. So I knew the warps existed, and I even spotted some areas where I thought there might be more. But I didn't connect it to the flower that was also on screen, so even with the knowledge that there were warps, the thought of having to explore every screen in the game, doing hours of playthroughs of trial and error looking for the correct routes, was just... it's not my jam. Not the way Barbuta is. These 2 games are very different, and I feel like I like and dislike them for opposite reasons. Barbuta is a janky, kind of frustrating to actually play knot, that is nevertheless a joy to unpick. Mooncat is a much more polished knot that I think is, maybe, tied a little too tightly. But I can understand how it might be someone else's jam, because that too is nostalgia for an older era of games where not everything was as spelled out to the player, where games were made to be cryptic on purpose, to pad out people's playtime so they wouldn't feel like they wasted their money. I can see the vision here. This is, in a way, what the entire collection feels like it's about. They could have made manuals for every game, but no, you go in with nothing but the basic controls. I actually finished Mooncat before I properly got into Barbuta, and I think if I'd done it the other way around, I might not have immediately reached for the guide with Mooncat. I almost regret it, that knee-jerk reaction to look up the answers. Is this what the convenience of modern game design and the prevalence of online guides has done to me? Food for thought. Barbuta and Mooncat are both amazing games and both well worth your time. as is UFO 50 as a whole. I guarantee you'll find something you love on there. Another favorite of mine is Night Manor, a point-and-click adventure horror game with multiple endings and a big mole person who chases you around. It's a good time. So in conclusion, don't skip Barbuta. Don't use a guide. You don't need one, and it's a better game without it. Sometimes a game can just be kinda cryptic, and that's a good thing. Meet it on its own terms. Now if you'll excuse me, I've got 47 more games to beat. Hey, what's this terminal thing for?